we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time listening, welcome. If not, welcome back. Like I always say, if you ever want to reach out to the podcast, please hit us up on our DMs on our Twitter or Instagram at the Bigmark Pod or the Bigmark Podcast. If you ever wanted to, let us know if you wanted to hear some topics or any comments about the show, please reach out. If you ever wanted to support the podcast, check out our Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpodcast. If you ever wanted to rate the podcast, please give us a 5-star review, if you will. It really does help the podcast. I know it doesn't seem like a lot, but it does help us in the old algorithms. And yeah, please share the podcast. If you like today's episode, please let your friends know. Even if you tell one friend, we can double the podcast overnight. So again, thank you so much for listening. And I'm really excited about today's episode. It's a really interesting topic. Came across in a podcast. It's kind of one of those stories that you've probably heard of, but you don't necessarily know about. And or maybe you don't necessarily know the details, or even if you haven't heard of it, once you hear it, it's kind of one of those stories where on the surface, it's definitely one thing, but when you kind of get into it, it really, really reveals just kind of how, and what humans are kind of capable of. I don't even know. When death isn't an option, I don't even know what it is. It's a amazing story. It's the story of Flight 71, Uruguayan Military Air Force Flight 571. The first time I actually ever heard about it was in a Seinfeld bit in one of the episodes. I was just watching it the other day, actually. And it's Jerry and George talking about the scene and what happens in the story, and they talk about it. And I've seen that episode a million times because I love Seinfeld, but I never really knew that the whole idea was from this story. And essentially, the story of Flight 571 is the story of a rugby team, a Uruguayan rugby team, who took a flight over the Andes and crashed. And then they had to start eating each other. Now, yes, this is a story of cannibalism. And as I'm telling you the story, it's hard not to forget that that's what this is. But there's so much more to the story, and I don't want you to think that this was, and they talk about it in the podcast that I heard about it, which is the You're Wrong About podcast, which I've only listened to this one episode, but it is a really, really good comprehensive view of this story. And they talk about this isn't necessarily a loss of humanity. It's actually humanity, or it's people trying their best to hold on to humanity. The story talks about what happens when a plane crashes into a glacier. It talks about what happens in a plane crash. It talks about surviving on a glacier. It talks about hiking up a glacier. And truthfully, again, like I said, the story is about the human experience, which again, there's a lot of times where people are, you can be in a very hopeless situation. But all you really need is a little bit of hope and some kind of goal, or at least someone near you. Maybe you might not have any hope yourself, but if there's someone around you that can provide that example of what it takes to kind of get through things, it really shows you. And I talk about that all the time on this podcast, right? Teamwork and sacrificing towards a goal and being all that. And I think this story really, really encompasses all that. Any type of survival situation, you're digging into something that's so primal and something that they also talk about this in the podcast, which I think is fascinating. They talk about how survival, we usually lend a lot of credence to survival in the wilderness, right? And this is a story of just that. But, people are also surviving every day and just day-to-day living life in the city and in so-called civilization. We'll talk a lot about the teamwork of these players, their faith, and again, there's some cannibalism involved. Anyway, it's beginning of October 1972. Stella Maris School for Boys, Catholic school in Uruguay, and Uruguay. I don't know. Maybe we should have figured that one out. But it was again a Catholic school, so it was run by like Christian brothers, and they weren't allowed to hit the kids. So they thought like, oh, let's let them play sports so they can kind of get some of that anger out. But they didn't want them playing soccer because they thought that led to egotism, which might be true. But they actually ended up choosing to teach the kids rugby instead of hitting the kids, essentially, but letting them hit each other. And all the players loved playing rugby so much that once they graduated, they missed it, and they started an alumni team. So this is the team, former alumnus. They were actually national champs of Uruguay in 1968 and 1970. The team consists of like 19, 20-year-olds. The oldest is 26. The youngest is 17. They're all very religious still. Obviously, they grew up Catholic and are still practicing. They're dedicated to each other, very dedicated to their sport. And they have an exhibition game in Chile coming up. So that's why they have to fly there. They charter a military plane. It's going to be cheaper. It's all the boys. They have a few other passengers to kind of fill up the plane. They sold the extra tickets. And the plane that they use, again, the military plane, it's a Fairchild FH-227D, nicknamed the Lead Sled. So obviously it's a piece of shit plane. And a couple other issues. There's a young pilot. He's, somewhat inexperienced. The Andes, where they have to fly over, the mountains of South America, the Andes altitude is about 20,000 feet. So the mountainous ranges, or the peaks, that's the word, the peaks that they have to fly over are about 20,000 feet, and the plane's max altitude is 22,500 feet. So you can't really cruise at max altitude. So basically that means they're going to have to navigate through the mountains instead of going completely over it. And you're not supposed to fly over the mountains in the afternoon. That is definitely brutal. The weather turns turns brutal, and you're not supposed to fly over the mountains in the afternoon. So that's all their issues right there. Anyway, they still get in the plane. They still figure out a way that is not going to be a big deal. It happens all the time. You know, the co-pilot was an experienced pilot, and he's going to be able to be involved. And essentially, even on the first day of their flight, when they take off, the first day of their trip, they have to make an emergency landing in Argentina because there's bad weather. So it wasn't like they crash landed, but they had to make a different alter their plans anyway for the night. Now, one big issue is that it's a military plane, and military planes can't stay on Argentinian soil for more than 24 hours. So they basically are forced to leave. And the players, they either have to go back home, which is safer, or they can go ahead with the trip. And the weather still isn't perfect, but the players convince the pilot to go ahead, despite the bad weather and the fact that it's the afternoon. So they're basically flying 100% when they should not be flying. Essentially, they crash into the mountain. I don't want to say right away, but basically they smash into the mountain pretty much as soon as they get there. The right wing is ripped off immediately. And as it gets ripped off, it cuts the tail off. So now there's a big, huge hole in the back of the plane. Some people get sucked out. The left wing then flies off, and now it's just like the fuselage of the plane. So it's just flying in the air, this tube. And luckily it lands at an angle that allows it to kind of slide down the hill instead of just like crumpling or smashing or like cartwheeling down the hill. And it ends up getting up to 200 miles an hour on this fucking sled ride down this hill, crashes into a snowbank, and it crashes so hard all the seats in the plane rip, and they get sent up to the front. So all these people get all crunched up in the front. They're all stuck. The people in the back who are free start helping, and basically some people are fucked up, broken legs, smashed heads, fucking crazy gashes and shit, and then some people are like basically totally fine. So obviously, like I mentioned before, it's mostly these rugby boys, but then there's a couple randos like that kind of joined in, but it's mostly these rugby boys. So some of these guys are like totally fine, and they're like built to play rugby. So they're like in pretty good shape. They're in season doing their thing, and they start saving these people. The captain of the team, Marcelo Perez, he's the one who actually starts kind of getting everyone together. Obviously, he's like the natural leader of the team anyway, and he starts getting people together. There's 45 survivors. Like I said, some have major injuries. Some are basically okay. Two of the survivors, Canessa and Serbino, are med students. So they become like the kind of natural doctors. It's kind of like a scene. This is kind of like the opening scene from Lost. I mean, it's a plane crash, but it's just hectic scenario, obviously. And they start to, again, Marcelo starts to kind of organize everybody and, kind of do the checks and make sure everything's okay. Now, during this whole thing, it's kind of going to be hard for me to get this across as much, but they seem to like kind of continue to play pranks on each other throughout this whole thing. They somehow find a way to have, I wouldn't say have fun, but make each other laugh and make each other smile, because again, there's something about this where you just have to kind of grin and bear it, and you just have to try and get through it and hope for the best, because there's no way that you could ever survive if you ever just like completely gave into the reality of the scenario, right? So one of the guys, Nando Parado, his head was basically like crushed. His skull was crushed in the crash. So now he's like down. He's completely in a coma. While they're digging through all these all the chairs and stuff. They're starting to kind of separate the dead bodies, and they starting to bring some of them outside. They bring Nando out with the crushed skull. They're kind of separating everything. Once they get all the seats out of the way, they make it to the cockpit, and in the cockpit, the pilot's dead, but the co-pilot's screaming, "We passed Kuriko over and over and over." And he's like fucking tripping out, freaking out. He's like gravely injured, but he just keeps repeating that over and over. And that night it went down to minus 40 degrees. And they were basically like in blazers and like rugby shirts and shit. And the way that they kind of like fought hypothermia was like apparently they kind of like punched each other in the feet and like kept each other warm by like moving around and stuff. And they used luggage to kind of barricade the hole in the back of the fuselage, and they all like stayed in the plane. I guess kept them warm enough. At this point, 32 out of 45 people are alive. Some people have died. They actually, when they were separating the bodies, they decided to pull Nando in, even though he wasn't dead, but he was passed out with the crushed skull. And they drank 5 bottles of wine on the first night to stay alive. And the next day, Marcelo, the captain, again starts assigning people tasks just to keep up morale. He's trying to fight despair. He doesn't want people getting down, so he's getting them to do stuff. If the very, very little food that they had, the typical lunch was like a little square of chocolate and a little small cap of wine. Kind of was like this like communion. And again, these guys are super Catholic. And again, this communion thing starts to become something that might happen in the future to more of a literal sense. Some players aren't very physically injured, but are mentally paralyzed. And some players are extremely physically injured, but are trying to do their best. So one player with 2 broken legs actually starts studying maps. And again, that Kuriko thing that the co-pilot kept repeating, he is the only clue. So he's trying to find this on the map and trying to determine where they are in the mountains. And he basically determines that they're almost across the Andes. So they're not like way, way far off from civilization. Again, Marcelo separated kind of people into different groups when he was getting them to do all these tasks. And some people were like on the medical crew. Some people were like kind of like keeping the cabin tidy and like, making sure everything's looking all right. And then some people were making water by melting snow, and they could like put it on aluminum foil, and they found a way. They painted SOS on the side of the plane with nail polish and lipstick. And 2 days in, they decided to go and kind of like take a little hike and look around and take in their surroundings. And they're basically on a pure glacier, ice everywhere, not even a fucking lichen, no algae, no small shrubberies, no birds, no nothing. They're like on a fucking sheet of ice, basically. By day 3, Nando actually wakes up. The dude with the fucked up skull, he actually wakes up, and he presses his head, and he can basically push in his skull is fractured, but he can press the pieces in like buttons. And he's basically okay. Apart from his fractured skull, everything's basically okay. And the doctors kind of say he probably survived that because it was so extremely cold. He was kind of like on ice, so his brain didn't swell too much to cause injury. By day 5, some people actually hike out to scout their position even better, and they realize that, I don't know if the map is wrong or whatever, but they just know that they're in an awful area. Crazy crevices and cracks and places. It's not like it's not an easy place to get to. It's not an easy place to get out of. They're in deep shit. After a week, the search party decides that they're looking for bodies, not survivors, because they think it's so cold that there's no way anyone's going to be able to survive it. And at this point, the boys are dehydrating about 5 times faster, because of all this moving around, because of all this in altitude. They are also burning mad calories, so they're basically starving, and they have almost no food now. They're eating chocolate and shit, and that's almost all gone. Nando actually has like a chocolate covered peanut that he eats over 3 days. He like slowly sucks off the chocolate, then eats one half, then eats another half. And by the end of that 3rd day, when he finishes the peanut, there is officially no more food. And again, there's nothing that they can scrounge for. There's nothing they can hunt for. There's nothing they can grab. Nothing. And one day all the boys are sitting around. Nando writes a book. So that's one of the big reasons why there's a lot of quotes from him. But it sounds like a really good book that I hope to read. But Nando and the boys one day were looking at another boy's leg wound. In the podcast, they don't really make it clear if this boy was alive or dead. But either way, Nando was looking at this boy's leg wound, and he was looking at it with, it's no mistaking it, he was hungry, and he could smell the blood, and he said he looked at human flesh and felt hunger. Looks around, all the boys know that they're all thinking the same thing, that they're hungry enough that they're willing to fucking eat somebody. It's kind of fucking scary, you know. In most of these survival scenarios that you hear about, there's something, and I guess there's that thing in the human mind where it's like, if there's something you can eat, if it's fucking bugs, if it's fucking whatever, you eat that before you're going to start eating people. But in this case, there's literally nothing. Obviously, this starts to spark a theological argument. They're all practicing Catholics. You know, they don't want to kill anybody. They definitely don't want to eat anybody. I don't know if that's actually on the books in Catholicism, but I highly anticipate the church frowning upon eating another person, especially if you kill them to do so. But you know, again, they have all these other dead bodies. They have people there. That it's there. And their argument is that God put the bodies there to eat, so that they basically have to. And essentially, eating the flesh of the dead would be like a communion. And now in certain interpretations of Christianity, they do truly believe that in the communion process, the priest is turning the bread and wine into literally the body and blood of Jesus Christ. And again, this is a very visceral and primal way of kind of thinking about it, but essentially got to the point where some of the guys were saying, like, if I die, I want you guys to eat me. And it's a strange theological place to put yourself in, right? Where again, you're saying God put this here for me to eat. So if I don't eat it, what is that saying? I don't know. It's a lot. You got to be in a fucking pretty hard scenario. Day 11 rolls by. The search gets called off because of the winter, and it's too hard. And essentially, that spurs on the boys to say, hey, fuck it. Now we have to escape ourselves. Marcelo, because the search gets called off and they've been up there for so long, Marcelo basically has a breakdown. Nando becomes the new leader, and he recruits the expeditionary team. Now, by this time, people are eating little slices of people, man. They're fucking eating bodies. And not everyone can do it. Some people, can't fucking can't eat it. I don't know how they fucking survived, to be honest, if they couldn't eat any of the food. Maybe they had a little bit. But some people in the beginning couldn't bring themselves to eat other people. And now Nando's mother and sister were on the plane too, and they unfortunately died in the crash and shortly after the crash, and no one was eating them out of respect for Nando. Like, my God, what a scenario. Eating, like, fuck. It's hard. It's like, it's kind of one of those things, especially when I was like researching. I didn't really allow myself to really think about this because it's just, it's part of the story. But damn, man, they were fucking eating people. Holy shit. So Marcelo has this breakdown. Nando becomes the new leader, and he recruits this expeditionary team where they're like, we're going to find our way out of here. We got to be the people who go, you guys stay here. You're all fucked up. People are still mad injured. We're going to go. So they start like basically training. They start eating more. They start sleeping better, all this shit. And about 2 weeks in, they encounter a major avalanche. So they're fucking showing up there. Crazy avalanche comes in, buries them all in the fuselage. The fucking snow like freezes instantly. Everyone's stuck inside the plane, and they start digging people out. And they basically dig themselves into a place that's about the size for 4 people to be in comfortably. And there's 19 people in this space, and those 19 people are the last survivors right now. Everyone else has died, especially in this avalanche. Took out quite a few people. And some of the people apparently that were actually trapped during the avalanche, thinking that they were going to die, but inevitably got rescued, kind of saw it as somewhat of relief. So again, you can just tell, like, fuck, could you imagine spending weeks up there? Holy shit. Like I said, the expeditionary force gentlemen, the expeditionaries as they called them, are getting preferential treatment. And after a month, about 3 weeks after the avalanche, they leave on November 15th. So they've been up there for over a month now. While they're out there, they actually find the tail section. There's warm clothes in there. There's lights. There's comics. There's food. There's fucking all types of shit. They're getting after it. And they realize that there's like a crazy storm coming in, so they got to get back to home base and bring some of the stuff that they got and the radio and all this stuff. And they got to go back to the crash site. And obviously the people at the crash site aren't too happy to see them back, but they're like, listen, this place is fucked. Like, you can't just like walk wherever we're going to go. The weather's starting to turn. And these crazy storms are preventing us from going ahead. So they're back, but they brought this radio back with them. So they're listening to the radio and they hear that because summer is just returning, because it's now November and it's the Southern Hemisphere, summer is starting. And the search is back on. So they're listening to the radio. They're hearing that they're basically the search team isn't searching necessarily in the right area. So Nando and 2 others set out to find help because they know they still have to take this into their own hands. On the trip, they actually end up sending one guy back and taking his food and going ahead because they know that 2 of them, it'll be easier for two to go ahead. And it's Nando and Canessa, one of the med students. And they make it basically to the foothills. And they meet this peasant family. They meet this dude on a horse who's got this family, and he brings them home and he lobs cheese at them and stuff. And he ends up bringing them to the police to help them find the crash site. And at this point, it's basically the 18th of December. So these guys have been up there for like 2 months. And there's 14 survivors. They bring them all back to the hospital. They have like their own wing in the hospital. They're doing their work on them, checking them out. And basically they realized that there was no other food up there to eat. So the doctors were the first to realize that These boys were eating people up there. And a couple rescuers apparently snapped some photos up there, and they released a photo of like a half-eaten leg in the snow or some crazy shit like that. And these guys are facing mad backlash, like, obviously. Now, what are they going to do? Just fucking die? Just fucking chill up there? Like, it's hard because, again, you don't even know what these guys were going through. These guys are going through like a serious fucking religious experience, essentially trying to figure this shit out. And again, they truly saw it as some type of communion, and that it was again a gift from God. And who fucking steps up in the end to speak up for them anyway? The Catholic Church. The Catholic Church actually defends the whole team. Obviously, they got a lot of heat, and Catholic Church said, listen, eating bodies is definitely not communion, but what these guys had to do, they had to do. And yes, that's the scenario, that there was no other food around, but there happened to be these bodies that were there, so they fucking got after it. The team actually still stays friends to this day. It's fascinating. They still get together every year. Nando actually became a race car driver, and they actually still chill with the peasant guy that they found on the horse. These guys seem to have an amazing sense of humor, because when they went to visit the man on the horse, Sergio, it was his 50th wedding anniversary, and they surprised him by meeting him in the street, or meeting him on the road, I should say, and saying, hey, we're lost. Can you help us find our way? And again, bittersweet ending, because obviously many people died. It's amazing that there were any survivors. But just, again, such a harrowing story. And again, as much as it seems like this was such a moment of dehumanization and the lowest of the low, and how could you ever get to eating people, and was it desperate, and people were accusing them of fabricating the avalanche story so they could say that they killed the weaker kids so that they could just eat them. Again, you're not killing people. These are your fucking teammates. You're not killing people to eat them. But these guys were at that point where they were saying, listen, if you don't eat me, I'm going to come back and haunt your ass. So there's something so deep and so interesting about the whole story, it shows you how, what you can do as a team too. It's surprising. The captain of the team, right? Marcelo, he steps up, right? And he starts making calls. He starts doing this, he starts doing that. And then when he breaks down, someone else steps up, and that's always the magic moment that happens in fucking sports. And these guys really brought that to life. And yeah, maybe it helped that they were like physically, strong, being rugby players and stuff like that. But again, these guys were up there for 2 months and had to eat each other. And my God, it's like George and Jerry were saying, it's him, George, and Kramer. So the scenario is George is posing a hypothetical scenario to Jerry, that himself, Jerry, and Kramer are flying over the Andes. They got a soccer game in Chile. See, it was soccer instead of football in the scene. And the plane goes down, and George asks Jerry, who would you eat first, George or Kramer? So again, things were kind of met with a lot of humor. Maybe it's what some of those guys would want. They still seem to maintain a humor, and that's the thing, is that's where the humanity still really, really, truly still exists, right? It's one of those things where you think you're going to be in the lowest point, that there's nothing that's going to keep you going. But when you have nothing left, maybe there is that spark that happens, right? And yeah, don't get me wrong, there were some guys out there that weren't really pulling their weight, but deep down there's a spark that somewhere. And just because these guys were surviving in the wilderness doesn't mean that there's not people surviving in town, and there's people surviving day-to-day life and driving cars and flying in planes normally and doing all that shit. There's just fucking danger. And we just kind of scoop past this, and we think that, survival in the wilderness is so much more like we look up to those people who are surviving out there instead of all the people that are out here surviving. So give yourself some credit. If you're going through anything, give yourself some credit, because just because it's not some fucking crazy grizzly bear hunting you down, it doesn't mean that you ain't going through some shit. Anyway, thank you for listening to the story. I thought it was an amazing story. Can't wait to read the book. Go check it out. It's called Miracle in the Andes, and there's another one called I'm Alive, there's a movie called Alive. Ethan Hawke is in it, I think. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, everybody. Like I always say, hit us up on our DMs if you want to talk. Twitter, Instagram, at the Bigmark Pod, at the Bigmark Podcast. Check our Patreon if you ever want to donate. Patreon.com/Bigmark Podcast. Give us 5 stars if you can. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that bell, hit the notification, subscribe to our channel. Let us know anytime, any place, anywhere. We love you all. Share the podcast. Love your friends. Don't eat your friends unless they ask you to. Love you all. Peace.